Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and in this episode, we will look into the much talked about Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, also known as CAI, between China and the European Union. To help us understand what is this all about and which are the stakes, I'm pleased to host Bert Hoffman, who is the director of the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore and previously for many years in China with the World Bank, first as the country economist and then as country director. Bert, thanks a lot for joining in The Sound of Economics from Singapore. First of all, how are things over there?
Singapore is basically quiet. The COVID is under control. The one problem is now that we can't travel yet, and everybody's eagerly awaiting the vaccine so that we can start traveling again. But domestically, Singapore is doing okay. It's quite hit in terms of the travel and tourism sector, but the government has been very responsive. So hopefully we're looking for a gradual recovery in this year.
That's great to hear. On the other side, Singapore is very small as a territory, so I can understand as well the eagerness for traveling. I'm also happy to have with us our Bruegel expert on China and a regular guest here at The Sound of Economics, Alicia Garcia-Herrero. Hi, Alicia, how are you?
Oh, fine, Giuseppe. Nice to talk to you and Bert.
Very well. So let's get into the subject matter of this episode. The EU and China have concluded on the 30th of December the negotiations for a comprehensive agreement on investment. And those negotiations took over 7 years. The CAI was intended to increase investment between the EU and China by establishing a legal framework and common rules on issues ranging from state-owned enterprises to subsidy, transparency, and rules against the forced transfer of technologies. The deal aims to replace more than 24 bilateral investment treaties between the EU's 27 member states and China. The agreement is also primarily supposed to improve market access for European companies operating or intending to operate in China and to ensure a level playing field when they do, as well as reciprocity. So based on that yardstick, the question is whether CAI fulfills such expectations. And I'm looking at Bert over the screen, and I would like to hear his point of view and kick off the conversation.
Well, thanks. Clearly, this has been 7 years in the making. I had the pleasure to read through it over the weekend, the legal text minus the annexes. This is a substantive agreement that makes some progress in a number of areas where there have been tensions, not just between China and the EU, but also more general about China's policies. If you're talking about access, a number of areas, there is now more access for European investors in China. At the same time, a number of sectors that are credited to be giving extra access, such as financial services, such as automotive, such as others, China had already moved on, and their domestic agenda is already ahead of this agreement, frankly, and that's maybe because they have been talking about it for 7 years. On the state enterprises, there is, if you want, that's the focus of the level playing field. There is language in the CAI that basically ties them to commercial behavior in interaction with other companies, and that's a win. Because that is not necessarily the case now. The question is, and because there's always a preference, if you want, for domestic enterprises if they procure goods and services. The question is about implementation, but we can come to that later. The third, subsidies. I think there is a minor progress there, and it's largely in the area of transparency, i.e. there is a mechanism for basically enticing companies, be it European, but particularly Chinese companies, to in the end provide the information, also from the government to provide the information what subsidies they are giving to certain companies. And finally, there is, if you want, that level playing field. The SOEs is a big part of that. But there is also access to regulatory consultations, as being foreign and domestic enterprises would have equal access to regulatory bodies, and a number of more detailed clauses that put more level playing field, if you want, in China. So it is progress. It's not dramatic progress, but definitely progress. We can talk later on about the sustainability clauses.
Yes, indeed. Alicia, what is your take on this?
To make a quick judgment, I would use the word underwhelming, but it all depends on what you were expecting. And I guess my assessment is based on the fact that this is a treaty. This is not a phase one deal. This is not an executive order. This is something that has to go through 27 parliaments plus the European Parliament, which basically means that this is not something you can change after 2 years. So the fact that we've come to an agreement where, and I'll avoid, labor rights and everything that actually made this treaty change its names from a humble bilateral investment agreement to a comprehensive agreement on investment. Yeah. So let's forget about that additional expectation, which I won't even comment on because finally I'm an economist and I don't know much about values, labor rights, and very little about climate change. So I will put that aside and I will focus on the three concepts that we've always used when negotiating the humble bilateral investment agreement with China, which basically are market access, level playing field, and reciprocity. So I'm going to judge this word underwhelming on that basis. On market access, we can have a longer discussion later, but my humble belief is that it is limited. We don't have the appendices yet, so it's hard to judge because we need to see exactly in which sectors. But, on the basis of the communique by the European Commission, it boils down to control on two sectors, electric vehicles and private hospitals, basically being able to open private hospitals in 10 major cities in China. We seem to believe, or at least that's what I've understood, that we won't get control for telecom and cloud, which were the ones that were mentioned, and the rest are basically not there. So, you can think of many other sectors that aren't included, including, of course, aircraft and aerospace and others that have been discussed. So, it's pretty limited. This is market access. Very quickly, and not to repeat what Bert already said, on level playing field, I actually think it's basically about transparency, subsidies, and SOEs. Let's put it, all of this together. Yes, transparency is indeed a big part of the document, and I think it's important, but without enforcement, it's hard to talk about transparency. And the enforcement part, in my humble opinion, is weak because we lack an investor-to-state dispute settlement, and we can discuss about that because we have indeed the existing, that's the response of the Commission. We still have the existing 25 bilateral investment agreements, but we all thought they were not enough. That's why we're heading into this one. So in a way, no by the way, and very important, subsidies, as Bert said, on services are there, but they're not subject to state-to-state dispute settlement. They're excluded, which means, again, we don't have any way to enforce that transparency or even the harm of those subsidies on services. Industrial is not even mentioned. It's all under the WTO still today. On our companies, European companies. So basically, yes, it can be more transparent, but very hard to enforce it. And reciprocity is not in the document. I leave it there. It's just not there.
Sorry, Alicia, let me interrupt you because you mentioned that this is not exactly automatically replacing the bilateral investment treaties between the EU member states and China. As far as I understood from the intention of the European Commission, there is this intention that this comprehensive agreement would replace those individual bilateral agreements. But you're saying that those bilateral agreements are still standing and they are still in place. What is exactly the process to let understand also our listeners what exactly this means?
Giuseppe, you're so smart. That question is so good because I also thought, and not because, I hold the truth, it's just because by reading documents from the European Parliament, but even documents at the time, 2013, when the whole thing started, the purpose was to substitute the bilateral investment agreements, 25 of them by now. And not only because we like to, kind of swap agreements in Europe, it's because this is now a European competence since the Lisbon Treaty. So, and because we actually argued even then that these agreements were not perfect. And especially they weren't perfect on the investor protection part of the story. You can check a very interesting document by the European Parliament briefing on exactly this point, judging, the strength of these bilateral investment agreements. And frankly speaking, making a point that we had to sign something because they were pretty limited in scope. But because there wasn't no agreement on investor protection, the Commission had to come up with something. And because it has to wait for 2 more years to negotiate, and frankly speaking, let's face it, part of the leverage is gone, because we are signing the deal now. So you wait for 2 years, but you don't know about the outcome. So as a way to prevent the lack of an instrument such as an investor to state dispute settlement, they will keep, and this is what I've heard from a number of advisors to the Commission, etc. Apparently, and even Commission staff, they will keep that part of the bilateral investment treaties that relates to investor. But you are right. I don't think this was the original intention. This is a consequence of the lack of agreement on investor protection.
So what you are saying is that for the principle of somehow almost reminding the principle of subsidiarity, when there are things which are covered in the agreement, this will substitute the individual bilateral agreements that they are in place, and where in the parts where there is no provision in the comprehensive agreement, then the bilateral older member states bilateral agreements will hold. Is that correct?
Giuseppe, I'm not a lawyer, but by listening to you, I can understand how hard it's going to become. I give you one example. France, in its bilateral investment agreement, has a clause which I'm sure resonates with you and others here listening to us, which is something like protecting the language and the cultural. So imagine, once you say that you are going to keep part of that bilateral investment agreement, France-China, what's going to happen with this specific clause, which is not covered in the EU-China? What are you going to do with that one? So, it opens a Pandora box of clauses that are not in the final deal, but perhaps were not meant to be, as opposed to those that we want to keep because we've not gotten a deal. Again, this is just from an economist's perspective. I'm not a lawyer, but it sounds complex to me.
Just to clarify, in Section 6, Article 15, it says previous agreements between the member states of the European Union and China are not superseded or terminated by this agreement. And even other clauses say that if there is laws that conflict with this agreement, those laws hold. So that's a little confusing, but maybe because both Alicia and I are not lawyers that we're still confused about that.
No, indeed. I mean, that's definitely one of those points that are not super clear. And I suppose that as the whole process will roll out, we will get more insight. But let's see if on one of the specific big topic that this guy should tackle, there is more clarity. And we mentioned level playing field and state-owned enterprises. I would like to dig a little bit more in depth into what KAI achieves on state-owned enterprises, especially because this was quite a controversial topic that has been spoken about in the past few months.
So again, the key clause in the draft text is that SOEs as a market party are supposed to work on market principles, and those market principles are defined basically the way you and I and Alicia would understand it. So basically not on non-commercial grounds choose certain suppliers in their procurement. That's a win. Again, enforcement is a second thing, but that's a win in terms of statement of principle. China's policies of basically competitive neutrality that they had pronounced a number of years back have never really gotten to the ground yet. And this is one way to look at it. And of course, one can verify that. One can verify whether decisions on procurement have been made in a certain way that can be considered as market principle. And that would change the nature of state enterprises. Of course, it's a complicated process, but now the principles are there in this agreement. So that is progress.
Alicia, what do you think?
Yes, let's put it this way. I do think that having China accept a clause where you do have such a statement that the SOEs are to behave as commercial entities is, of course, a plus. But there are exceptions in the document, related to non-commercial activity, which you can agree with, but there's also this sense of how to define that commercial activity. So in other words, it's not operational. I wish we could have had something more operational, such as competitive neutrality. I've been arguing in favor of this for a long time. We'll have a paper published this week, Giuseppe, on this point by Bruegel. So I think it's good, but it's a missed opportunity to get something more clear. I have to say that I would agree with China in that might not be the way to do it, meaning I don't want to use a document such as an international document or, like in this case, treaty for Europe to define how I'm going to operate my state-owned companies. So it would have been ideal, in my opinion, for China to come up with something out of its own interest and then place it there. Same with the foreign investment law, say, like although doubts, of course, as to whether this was pushed by the US or not. But I'm sure China already wanted to change from a positive list to a negative list under the investment front. Same thing here. If China could have pushed a bit further in SOE reform and then placed that into this agreement, I think it would have been more welcome, in my opinion, because it would have been more meaningful than, yes, SOEs need to operate under this commercial, but no way to enforce it, no way to even measure it before enforcing it. How can you enforce something you cannot really prove because there's no definition? I mean, I've heard from the Commission in some of these exchanges that the clauses on SOEs would be very similar to the TTP. I just couldn't find that, but it might be my ignorance, but I just couldn't find it in the document. And in fact, I was waiting eagerly to, not that the clauses, I mean, the original TTP might have been better. I frankly can't judge, but I've checked the CPTPP clauses. And if you ask any, Vietnamese official, they will tell you that's an easy peasy thing to comply with. So, so first of all, if that's the bar, it's not like competitive neutrality, to be frank. Second, I can't find the bar in the document, but that might be my own, ignorance.
So to resume in one sentence, Bert, what is our take in the end of the day about state-owned enterprises and KAI? Is it progress? Is it like just an half-baked solution, or is just an open question that will stay?
Well, again, I would want to use the word modest progress. But I have to emphasize that, of course, this is not the only tool that the EU has for SOE behavior. I mean, this is about commercial practices. Of course, the big concern in the European Union is that SOEs or state-supported enterprises come and invest in Europe and buy European companies with support from the state, and then basically take out the competitive edge of the EU. This is not the agreement that deals with that. This is an agreement that defines a bit in its procurement behavior what state enterprises are supposed to do. That's much more modest than the broader issue. But as I said, there's other instruments, there's other tools that are either in the making or already on the books in the EU. So one cannot blame this agreement. I mean, not everything can be in one agreement. Let me put it like this. This is modest progress.
But the question I have for you is, just imagine that, I don't know, any company, State Grid tries to buy, say, an electricity grid in Germany. It happened in Berlin, tries, and it's stopped. And China considers that this goes against the agreement. And there's no new regulation. Okay, on the basis of the existing regulation, can China use state-to-state arbitration, which is clearly in very detail defined in the treaty, to claim that that's using national security beyond what, say the case of Sweden today? So my point is, I understand that this is a tricky question because nobody knows, but how can you, does China have an edge, in other words, by signing this agreement to argue against a decision taken by a European member state of stopping an acquisition? What do you think?
So they can try. There's no question that they can then use this agreement and say, we want arbitration. And then the EU can say, sure, fine. We can first wait 150 days. We can just wait 150 days. That's in the agreement. And then we can talk, and then we can, go through the process. We have arbiters, and then in the end, the arbiters will find something. And then we can still disagree.
So another aspect that I wanted to see with you and go a little bit more into the details are the environmental clauses and whether there is an advancement over there in terms of the way sustainable development is taken into account when it comes to investments between China and the EU.
Right. So there's basically two aspects on that. And the one is the Paris Agreement. And again, this sort of reflects the agreement, reinforces the Paris Agreement. But again, this reflects that, they've been talking about it for a long time because China's already moved beyond the Paris Agreement. As a matter of fact, right now, as we speak, they are scrambling to find out and to put into the 14th five-year plan that's going to be approved in March what Xi Jinping's commitment of net zero carbon by 2060 means. And that is a far sharper agreement. There's actually an agreement that would up the ante on the Paris Club commitments that China has made. So it's fine, but in a way that is already history. And it's still good to have a mechanism that the EU can monitor and exchange views. The EU has a lot to offer in this area. So that may create some business opportunities. But in terms of setting the bar higher, that's not the case. The bar is already much higher than the Paris Agreement. On the labor ILO conventions, that is the second major leg. And there, frankly, there's a lot of debate has been there, and that is, of course, a little bit disappointing. China commits to continue to strive to rectify the ILO agreement on forced labor. In general, the core conventions and the specific one, the forced labor. Now, that's good and that's nice of China to commit to that, but that convention has been around since 1930. So if they haven't come around to implementing it yet or rectifying it yet, then there's probably a number of domestic factors that prevent them from doing so. Not all countries do. The United States has not rectified that convention because of its domestic practices, in part because of prisoner labor is one of the aspects that prevents them from rectifying it. So China is not alone there. But I think we also have to be realistic that this agreement is not going to lead China to rectify and implement the ILO conventions.
So if I may say, from what you are saying, both on the environmental stuff and the ILO, even if the environmental stuff is more promising, basically there's nothing new under the sun. Those are just confirmations of trends which are over there, and there is not something that is put in motion on those areas by that agreement specifically. It's just that within this agreement there are certain processes which are happening anyway in a way or another, either slowed down in the case of the labor or either pushed for, like in the case of the environment, which has just crystallized over there.
So on the labor, there's one positive on both, and then one specific one on the labor. The positive one on both is actually in the process. And one may believe in it or not, but I've always felt that regularly sitting down with China at an appropriate level and discussing issues is helpful. So something that is at the final clauses, the investment committee, is a positive step. So, and the EU can regularly raise environmental issues, can regularly raise labor issues that they have observed in the past, that they also hear from their companies, and they can raise it at a level which is the vice premier level. That is really quite high. So they can discuss it probably with a Liu He equivalent to whoever's going to be the successor in the future. That is positive by itself. Specifically, I've yet to see how that is going to be implemented, but there is also an avenue towards independent investigation of labor practices. So even if China is not going to rectify and implement the ILO conventions, there is still a right for the parties, or the party and the EU in this case, to have an independent investigation in labor practices. So to at least immunize or hold harmless the EU companies in China from certain practices. So that by itself will probably make life a bit easier for many EU companies and US companies for that matter that are struggling with keeping their supply chains clean of any undesirable labor practices or environmental practices for that matter.
So that's definitely positive. Alicia, you've been discussing before about the fact that in the end of the day, there is very little in this agreement about the enforcement, mechanisms of enforcement about it. And I think that it's perhaps good to spend a little bit of time with our listeners to get back on this issue. What exactly is foreseen in terms of implementation, enforcement of the treaty?
I actually think that we need to separate this, I would call them ambitions of the EU on climate change, on labor rights, where, of course, not this treaty and probably many have any enforcement clause. And I don't find that strange, because why would you bring, a state-to-state dispute settlement on labor issues, which are so domestic? Okay, we may disagree with this, but I wasn't expecting that, and I understand that. On the commercial part of the story, meaning market access, let's focus on market access, because that's where basically the bulk of the benefits for Europe, in my opinion, are. The rest are multilateral benefits, and they're not coming from these agreements, say China's foreign investment law, or, things that China is giving to the whole world, which is great. But why would we have to have a particular enforcement mechanism in that treaty? So forget about all of that. Let's talk about bilateral issues. What China gave us in terms of electric vehicles, or you name it. How can we make sure this happens? I think the mindset of the Commission when reaching an agreement was that this is like a phase one type deal. We have so many other instruments that we can then eventually bring to the table and kind of, I wouldn't say threaten, but, like leverage upon. And frankly, we already have those instruments, and nothing has really happened when we had some kind of strategic retaliation. We had lately quite a few cases, pork in Germany. I mean, we can ask the Australians how much leverage they have. So all of those additional instruments, I would just take them off the table, because they haven't worked so far. And I don't think we can count on them working after signing this agreement on a much higher scale. Why? What's the change? So let's focus on what we have there. And there we have state to state, this wonderful arbitration, which looks very scary to any company. It's not, by the way, as the agreement states it, it's confidential. Not that state to state dispute settlements are always fully open, but there is some openness and some transparency in some of the stages of the dispute, which isn't the case according to the document here. It looks really quite close into. So, for a company, it's like a tunnel where you can't really see the light. I mean, why would I engage my government into such arbitration without really knowing what's going to happen? So in other words, I feel that the investor protection is really the weakest part. And again, it is so much the case that we go back to the original bilateral investment agreements to deal with it. That's kind of the proof of the pudding, that of course we've not moved very far. Otherwise, we could simply lift those agreements, which are going to make a lot of probably lawyers very wealthy, because we will have to know which one is in place for every clause, So that's my take on this one.
I see. We still have a little bit of time, but not too much time within this episode. But there is one other and perhaps last issue I would like to touch upon, which is a broader one, I'd say more political one. We've been seeing the substance of this treaty. We've been seeing what kind of timid progress it makes on certain issues, but as well how it is limited. I mean, that's at least what I understand from your analysis, that there is a sort of limited scope for such a treaty. So the question that has been floating around with a lot of commentators has been like, why now? Why this agreement in that specific form? And what exactly does it mean, politically speaking, or like within the geopolitical setting that we are at the moment in which this agreement has been finalized and published, which is, also around the change of the administration in the United States. So, Bert, I'm looking at you. What is your take on that?
Well, right. Look, clearly in Beijing, this was seen as a major win, as a political win. And people don't talk about as passionately as Alicia and I about arbitration clauses and all that. They just say, look, the EU sided with us in this big geopolitical battle. The EU, just like as Asia sided with us through the RCEP, the EU now sided with us through the CAI, and that's a major win. For Europe, I'm sure a lot more will come out during, but even before the discussion in Parliament. But for Europe, my impression from afar is that the big driver of this agreement was Germany. They really wanted to have a win during the presidency of Germany. And they succeeded more or less in that. I mean, to have a draft, at least a political agreement on this. So that was, again, a political move, plus a number of side deals that helped push this agreement over the finishing line. So that also had quite a strong political motivation. At the same time, 7 years is a long time, and to talk a lot longer has its political downsides as well. But I do believe that there was a bit of there's some explaining to do in Washington. And clearly, indeed, the Secretary of State already said, look, why don't you wait a bit and let's discuss a more common approach. The EU would say, well, but we can still do a common approach. This does not preclude in any kind of way a common approach going forward. But I think that's a little cheeky, frankly, because it sets a signal. So if they would have set a signal by saying, let's wait until the US comes in and let's define that common approach and then move on to have this agreement in the framework of that common approach, that would have been better. Of course, there is an aspect of history. The past 4 years haven't been that great for US-EU cooperation. And so maybe this was also a political signal for the EU towards the United States saying, look, this autonomy that we have, well, this is it. So we can exercise it. And so that is a signal for the future. So there's a lot of political consideration that I think went into this decision to sign it before the end of the year.
Indeed, the concept of strategic autonomy has been really a catchword, a catchphrase in Brussels in the past period of time.
Beijing welcomes the catchphrase.
I can imagine. But Alicia, do you think that this was really a move towards more strategic autonomy of the EU, or was it more of a calculated effort within, like the German presidency trying to get a result and score back home, and a fatigue of 7 years, and Xi telling to von der Leyen at the summit, we need to close this by the end of the year? Where is the EU over there? I mean, is it really on the driving seat?
Okay, so I just would advise or make this suggestion to Commission officials or other negotiators to read the media in China and see how the whole thing is portrayed, whether rightly or wrongly. It is certainly not perceived as a signal of strategic autonomy. Whether we see it that way is a different matter. Now, of course, it does show that we can that we can close a deal. And that's of course interesting. But the point is that our deals tend to be very complex, complete, because again, just to renew the one with Mexico, it took us, I don't know how many years. I mean, and Mercosur has been waiting for 20 years. So, the 7 years is actually not such a bad average, given, the time it takes us to negotiate. But what is important is that once you get a deal, it is relevant. And I think the point now is, if your strategic autonomy is used to pursue deals that we do with executive order, the US, fine with me. That's not a signal of strategic autonomy because you're not changing anything relevant. You see? So in other words, I would buy that if I had seen a big deal. Then you say, look, you've taken your decision. You want to be closer to China, or maybe find, equidistant to China. That's fine with me. But it doesn't show that because the deal is small. It's like, okay, you really wanted to play with fire for these very few benefits. That's, I think, how the US is going to read it. That's why I don't think it's going to achieve the purpose, which I would have loved to, in a way, at least we show a signal, big signal, but this is not a big signal. And just to end with this, it's not going to be for free because this is a new administration. And by the way, when we started pursuing this BIT in 2013, we were following that very same administration, which was pursuing or negotiating its own BIT with China. So those same guys, sorry to say, we were following them just to get the same conditions without much effort. Now we kind of moved before them. Not really, because we're following the phase one deal, once again, because we were left out of the phase one deal. Is this really so strategic and so autonomous? If you told me that the EU kind of thought of grand deal within the CPTPP, maybe changing some conditions and improving that would have been a to me like something amazing, like you suddenly realize Asia as a whole is important. You move before the US, you create a big, higher level kind of agreement. I know that it's impossible to do that as quickly as Kai. But, let's not forget, this is the pandemic year for Europe. This is not the strongest time on earth for Europe to sign such an agreement. So I want to signal that I'm strategically autonomous, I'm not sure I would sign. And this is beyond the US elections. It's about us. Were we in a strong position when we signed this agreement? That's my question.
And that's a good question for further reflections. And of course, we could stay over and discuss about not only Kai, but all those issues which are much more broader than the text of the agreement itself, which are super relevant for our discussion. But unfortunately, we have to close the episode. And I want to thank Bert for joining from Singapore. Thank you so much.
It was a great pleasure.
And of course, thank you, Alicia, for once again participating to The Sound of Economics. And I would like to thank all our listeners and remind them that they can access all our analysis on China, but as well about other issues related to economic policy on the Bruegel website on www.bruegel.org. Until next time, bye-bye.